Berlin, April 1945. NTHE City was nothing but bones of stone and smoke. Rubble stretched for miles, glass crunched under boots, and the stench of fire clung to every breath. German women, former nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries, were marched in groups of 12, their once proud uniforms now reduced to rags. They carried brooms and buckets instead of rifles, ordered to sweep streets that no longer existed. For them, captivity meant humiliation, working under guard while Berlin itself bled. An NTHE silence of ruin was only broken by the hollow echo of distant gunfire. American soldiers stood nearby, rifles slung casually, watching as the women pushed broken bricks into piles. To the prisoners, every sound felt heavy. They expected harsh commands, punishment for moving too slowly, maybe even kicks. That was what their own officers had done when morale collapsed. But the Americans, young and weary, looked more bored than brutal. And then it happened, something none of the women could have predicted. From the side pocket of a dusty Jeep, a U.S. private pulled out a battered field radio. He twisted the dial. Static hissed, then a burst of brass hit the air. Swing music. The sound cut through the silence, like sunlight through a cellar. At first, the German women froze. Music had become alien in Berlin. The Reich had replaced rhythm with marching chants and propaganda speeches. Now, in the heart of devastation, the rhythm of America, fast, playful, alive, spilled into their prison. One woman whispered, "This is not war. This cannot be war." Another shook her head, refusing to look. For them, this sound was a cruel taunt, a reminder of what they had lost and what their conquerors still carried. But curiosity spread faster than fear. Brooms stopped moving, hands rested against broken walls. Even the guards shifted uneasily, surprised by their comrades' boldness. And then, with a grin almost too innocent for this ruined city, a young GI stretched out his hand toward a German nurse. She hesitated, eyes darting between the rubble, the gun slung across his chest, and the faint smile beneath his helmet. The other women stared, not knowing whether to gasp or laugh. NNSHE stepped forward. The silence was broken. The dance was about to begin. The young American's hand hung in the air for a heartbeat, suspended between rubble and radio static. The German nurse, hair dusty, sleeves rolled, eyes hollow from weeks of defeat, finally placed her hand in his. Gasps rippled through the line of prisoners. The guards glanced at each other, uncertain whether to intervene. And then, as if the ruins themselves demanded it, they moved. Awkward at first, shuffling over cracked cobblestones, their steps stumbled against the jagged rhythm of rubble. But the radio didn't care. The trumpet blared, the drums insisted, and Berlin's broken street became an impromptu dance floor. NNTHEGI guided her gently, boots crunching against glass shards. He twirled her once, slowly, careful not to frighten her. She couldn't suppress a faint smile, almost against her will. For a second, her prisoner's armband disappeared, and she was simply a young woman swept into music. Around them, the other German women froze, broom handles clutched like spears. Their faces held disbelief. They had been told Americans were savages, destroyers, men without honor. Yet here stood one, smiling, swinging, treating a prisoner not as an enemy, but as a partner. Swing had been banned in Nazi Germany since 1935, denounced as degenerate music. Yet here it was, bouncing off ruined walls, defiantly alive. U.S. forces carried thousands of field radios. Swing was not just entertainment, it was identity. Soldiers who had marched through mud and blood now clung to rhythm as the rebellion against despair. And that rhythm was contagious. Another GI joined in, coaxing a second German woman forward. She shook her head, laughed nervously, but finally stepped into his arms. Suddenly, what had been a chain gang of defeated prisoners became a gathering of dancers. Broken windows reflected motion, boots tapped against shattered stone. Even the guards, who knew they should stop this, found themselves grinning at the absurdity. One prisoner whispered under her breath, "We had been stripped of uniforms, yet they gave us rhythm instead of shame." The irony was brutal. Their own leaders had marched them into destruction, demanding obedience until the end. The enemy offered swing steps instead of orders, and as the trumpets blared louder, others began to clap. What started as one pair grew into a scene Berlin had not seen in years: laughter, music, and movement amid the ashes. The dance had only begun, and the crowd was swelling. The sound of laughter in Berlin's ruins spread faster than fire in dry timber. One pair became two, two became four, and soon the prisoners were no longer sweeping rubble but circling to the rhythm of a foreign beat. The cobblestones shook under the shuffle of boots and heels. Brooms clattered to the ground, forgotten. For a city that had only known sirens and shellfire, the shock of swing was like a hallucination, and passers-by noticed. First, a few gaunt civilians, creeping from shattered doorways, then children, barefoot, soot-streaked, peeked around corners, drawn by the strange sight. The guards hesitated, hands tightening on rifle straps, but they did not intervene. Even they seemed mesmerized. Within minutes, what had been a routine POW work detail transformed into a spectacle. NNBY, the end of the war. Allied reports estimated over 300,000 German women had been captured across Europe, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, widows who had been pressed into service. Many carried memories of abuse at the hands of their own officers, public humiliation, shaved heads, punishments for disobedience. And yet here, on a rubble-littered Berlin street, their captors allowed them not only to exist, but to dance. The contrast was unbearable, almost comic. One woman later recalled in a letter, "It was the first time since the bombs fell that we saw laughter. Not forced, not hollow, real." The moment blurred the line between guard and captive, victor and vanquished. Children began clapping to the beat. Some whistled. A ragged old man leaned on a cane, shaking his head as if the world had spun too far off its axis. NNTHE music bounced between ruined walls, echoing into cellars where civilians had hidden for weeks. Each note carried danger. Fraternization was technically banned. American soldiers faced punishment if caught mingling with German women. Yet the dance swelled, as though rules had dissolved along with the Reich. Enemy eyes narrowed at the absurdity. Prisoners who had expected shame were twirling skirts, laughing through hunger. Guards who had prepared for monotony were now spectators to joy. For a moment, war retreated, replaced by rhythm, NNBUT. As the crowd swelled larger, tension shifted. Civilians stood silent at the edges, watching not with joy, but with something darker: resentment, hunger, disbelief. Their city was dying, yet here were prisoners laughing with the enemy. The mood was about to change. The crowd thickened. Civilians, half-starved and hollow-eyed, crept closer to the noise. They emerged from cellars with faces pale as chalk, clutching bread crusts, children clinging to skirts. To them, the sound of swing blasting across Berlin's ruins felt unreal. For months, their lives had been measured only in rations and air raid sirens. Now, the ruins of Wilhelmstrasse echoed not with orders from the Reich, but with American jazz. Children clapped along, their tiny hands red from cold. A little girl laughed, spinning in place, mimicking the POWs' dance steps. A gaunt mother grabbed her arm sharply, whispering through clenched teeth, "Don't." The humiliation was unbearable. To see German women, uniforms torn, hair dusty, laughing with conquerors while Berliners starved, was a wound sharper than hunger. NNBY, April 1945, rations had collapsed to barely 1,000 calories per day in Berlin. Bread lines snaked around rubble heaps. Civilians survived on watery soups, roasted beets, and sometimes nothing at all. The average Berliner had lost nearly 20 pounds in body weight by war's end. Against this backdrop, to watch prisoners receive not punishment, but laughter felt like betrayal. Some muttered curses. Others stood in silence, the sound of trumpets stabbing like knives. "We hated them for feeding us," one civilian later admitted, and hated more that they danced while we starved. It was not the music alone, but what it symbolized: abundance. Swing was more than rhythm. It was proof that the Americans had energy, food, and freedom enough to spare, even in the heart of ruins. One boy stared wide-eyed as a soldier spun a German nurse across the cobblestones. Sighs. His jaw worked silently. Chocolate, he remembered, was something whispered about, almost mythical. The Allies seemed to carry it in crates. His stomach twisted at the thought. NNTHE POWs themselves sensed the shift. Laughter faltered at the edges as they noticed the hollow faces watching. What had been spontaneous joy now seemed dangerous. A moment of escape risked becoming a spark of resentment. And yet, just as the atmosphere thickened with unease, a single gesture shifted everything. From the pocket of a GI's jacket came a small, crinkled wrapper. He knelt, extended it to the boy staring at the dancers. A chocolate bar, brown, rich, impossible in Berlin, 1945, glimmered in the ash. NNTHE boy reached forward, and the city held its breath. The boy's fingers trembled as he reached for the chocolate bar. Around him, silence pressed heavy. An entire crowd of defeated Berliners watching one scrap of sweetness cross the line between victor and vanquished. When the crinkled wrapper finally touched his hand, the crowd exhaled all at once. A sound somewhere between a gasp and a sigh rolled through the ruins. For a city starved of everything, chocolate was more than food. It was wealth, power, a miracle. NNTHE boy tore into the bar with desperate speed, breaking off a piece before shoving it into his mouth. His eyes widened as the taste hit: sugar, fat, cocoa. He hadn't known such richness since before the war. His mother tried to pull him back, ashamed, but the boy shoved another chunk at her, insisting. Around them, hungry eyes darted. Some stared at the GI with anger, others with longing. A single bar had exposed the chasm between Berlin's ruin and America's abundance. NNTHE United States shipped over 7 million chocolate bars into Europe by 1945. To Americans, they were rations, comfort food, something soldiers tossed around casually. To Germans, chocolate had become a memory. Wartime substitutes, made from barley, acorns, or saccharin, had replaced the real thing years earlier. Now, in one gesture, the occupier had revealed the scale of difference. One side still had sweetness to spare, the other was measuring life in watery soup. NTHE German women, still dancing awkwardly in the rubble, felt the shift most deeply. A prisoner whispered, "A single sweet weighed more than our uniforms, more than our pride." Their own people had fed them fear and punishment. The enemy offered rhythm and chocolate. The humiliation was undeniable, but so was the relief. NNTHE music swelled again, horns bouncing off the stone shells of buildings, but the moment was no longer innocent. Every clap of a child, every twirl of a skirt now carried the flavor of cocoa on a starving tongue. Civilians stared at the chocolate bar as if it had become Berlin's last treasure. And as the boy licked melted chocolate from his fingers, another thought spread silently through the crowd. If the Americans could hand out sweets so casually, what else were they capable of? NNTHAT question echoed louder than the music, and the prisoners knew it would not remain unanswered. The sweetness lingered on the boy's lips, but for the German women, the taste was sharper, bitterness mixing with disbelief. Their memories pulled them back, away from swing rhythms and cocoa, into the barracks where discipline had ruled with cruelty. Under the Reich, women auxiliaries had lived under codes of fear. Orders barked, punishments swift. One wrong word to a superior could mean confinement, shaved hair, or worse. It wasn't food or music that defined their service. It was humiliation. They remembered long marches in mud, officers inspecting them like machines, stripping individuality until nothing was left. They recalled propaganda speeches that condemned them for showing weakness, for crying, even for laughing. In 1943, directives had demanded that female staff maintain iron discipline under threat of penal labor. One nurse later wrote, "We were punished more harshly by our own officers than by the enemy." The Reich called them servants of the fatherland. The reality was chains of shame. And yet here they were, dancing in rubble, being treated less like prisoners and more like human beings. The irony cut deep. The same women once forced to salute portraits of Hitler were now twirling to American jazz. Their own commanders had stripped them of dignity, but the enemy, these boys with radios and chocolate, offered gestures of respect. Reports indicate that Nazi codes allowed female auxiliaries to be whipped or jailed for minor infractions, such as untidy uniforms or speaking out of turn. Compare that to the Americans, who, despite strict non-fraternization orders, allowed a few stolen minutes of swing. For the prisoners, the contradiction was staggering. They had braced for cruelty but found rhythm instead. One POW whispered to another, watching the soldiers laugh, "The enemy treated us with more dignity than our own officers ever had." It wasn't admiration. It was shock, a collapse of the certainty they had been fed. If the enemy showed kindness, what did that say about the system they had served? But, even as their worldview cracked open, the music drove them forward. Skirts swayed, boots tapped, rubble became rhythm. And beneath every step came the question no one dared ask aloud. Had they fought for the wrong side all along? The answer would begin to reveal itself, not through arguments, but through the transformation in motion still unfolding on that ruined street. The street no longer resembled a prison detail. It looked like a ballroom carved out of ruins. The radio crackled, horns blared, and suddenly the German women weren't prisoners. They were dancers, skirts swaying as if fabric could forget the dust clinging to it. The rubble itself became part of the rhythm, their steps crunching glass in sync with drum beats. For the first time in months, laughter spilled louder than commands. N.A. Corporal pulled out a harmonica, the silver instrument flashing in the weak afternoon light. He blew a riff that twined with the radio's swing, turning the chaos of rubble into harmony. One woman, hair pinned hastily under a kerchief, spun with surprising grace, her shoes slapping uneven cobblestones. Another clutched her sides, laughing as she stumbled into her partner's chest. The guards, rifles slung, clapped quietly, unable to suppress their own grins. Music had been stripped from these women's lives. Under the Reich, they'd been told to serve, obey, and endure. But in that fractured Berlin street, they were reminded of something else, what it meant to be young, alive, capable of joy. U.S. forces carried more than weapons. They brought instruments, radios, and records by the thousands. Reports show over 500 portable instruments were distributed among Allied units across Europe. Swing wasn't just background noise. It was morale itself, portable proof of abundance and energy. German women couldn't miss the contrast. Their own officers had punished laughter. Their own regime had outlawed swing, branding it degenerate. And now, here in defeat, the very music banned in their homeland returned as freedom's rhythm. The steps were clumsy, skirts dust-stained, but the movement itself was rebellion, against hunger, against despair, against the silence of ruins. One POW murmured, "We realized our world had ended, but another might begin with music." It wasn't surrender to the enemy. It was surrender to humanity, to rhythm that reminded them of lives they once had before uniforms and armbands. Tempo quickened. Feet stomped, hands clapped, and for a moment it seemed Berlin itself had joined. Yet in every stolen laugh, in every swing of hips, lay the risk of discovery. Rules still loomed above them, cold as rubble. And soon, authority would catch up with rhythm. Even as the last note from the harmonica stretched into the fading air, the sound of boots on pavement signaled the arrival of command. The rhythm collapsed when heavier boots struck the cobblestones. A U.S. officer, cap tilted low, pushed through the circle with a face like carved stone. The harmonica died in mid-note. The radio was yanked silent. The women froze, their arms still half raised in dance, skirts swaying with the last echo of music. The street returned to rubble and silence in an instant. NNTHE officer's voice cut sharper than any trumpet. Rules are rules. Fraternization, the forbidden word, hung in the air like smoke. Since 1944, Allied command had circulated strict orders, no contact with German women beyond necessity. The reason was simple: discipline. To laugh, to dance, to share sweets was seen as a crack in the armor of occupation. And now, here it was, playing out in the open like a circus. NNTHE soldiers stiffened, shame and frustration mixing in their eyes. Some avoided looking at the prisoners, others clenched fists around their rifle straps. They had risked reprimand for a few stolen minutes of joy. The women, for their part, bowed heads, bracing for punishment. But no orders came for their arrest. The officer barked commands instead. Back to sweeping, back to rubble, back to silence. It was a jarring pivot. Only minutes earlier, the same street had pulsed with rhythm. Now it was heavy with guilt. Civilians who had crept from ruins melted back into shadows, muttering under their breath. Children who had clapped fell quiet, clutching their mothers' skirts. Even the boy with the chocolate bar slipped away, chewing slowly as if afraid to be noticed. NNTHE officer's anger wasn't cruelty, it was bureaucracy. He had seen war drag on too long to allow cracks in discipline, and yet his orders could not erase the memory of what had happened. The prisoners shuffled brooms across stones, but their steps betrayed something different. They had been lifted, even if only for a song's length. One German nurse caught her breath and whispered to the woman beside her, "The music ended as suddenly as it began, but we carry it inside." Her words lingered like an echo, a quiet rebellion against silence. And as the officer marched away, the rubble crew bent once more to their meaningless task, but their minds remained on rhythm, not bricks. And in the stillness, whispers of what they had just experienced passed from woman to woman, promising the memory would outlast the silence. Night settled over Berlin like a shroud. Fires still smoldered in distant blocks, and the broken city lay in uneasy silence. The women were marched back to their holding barracks, the day's dance sealed behind barbed wire. Yet the rhythm would not die. Whispers spread through the rows of cots, each woman replaying the moment in her head, holding it close like contraband. One nurse slipped a scrap of paper from her pocket, a torn ration stub where she had scribbled the lyrics of a swing tune she barely understood. She folded it carefully and hid it in her boot. For her, it was not just words, it was proof that the world outside war still existed. Others whispered of chocolate, of laughter, of the strange kindness of a hand extended in rubble. Prisoners who had expected only scorn found themselves replaying the memory of movement, of music, of dignity. Post-war surveys would later reveal a striking statistic. Over 40% of German POWs described U.S. captivity as humane, or even surprisingly humane. For women especially, the contrast was brutal. They had braced for degradation, yet encountered gestures of respect that cracked their certainty. The Reich had promised them glory but delivered only ruin. Their captors offered rhythm in the ashes. In the barracks, silence eventually returned. Guards paced outside, boots echoing against wire, but inside, one woman hummed faintly under her breath. Another tapped her fingers against a cot frame, mimicking the swing beat that had pulsed through their bodies hours earlier. Even as hunger gnawed and fear pressed down, the rhythm kept returning, unstoppable, like a ghost of freedom. NNTHE irony was undeniable. The war was lost. Their homes destroyed, their futures uncertain. And yet, in that moment of defeat, something unexpected had been given back. Humanity, not through speeches, not through mercy, written in orders, but through the simple act of dance. A gesture so ordinary it became extraordinary amid the ruins. Years later, some would tell the story in fragments, how in the rubble of Berlin, prisoners and conquerors had shared laughter. Most details blurred, but one truth endured: the memory of a dance where music replaced commands, and rhythm momentarily dissolved the war. NNTHE lesson lingered long after the boots marched away. In ruins, even enemies could find common ground, not in ideology, but in a song.